When it comes to fantasy TV shows, few things are more disheartening than investing in a high-concept series only to have it cancelled mid-story. Netflix, in particular, has built up a frustrating track record of shelving promising fantasy shows just as they start to find their footing. The OA, 1899, Shadow and Bone, the list goes on. With sprawling worlds, rich lore, and complex character arcs, fantasy shows need time to breathe, but too often they are axed after a season or two. It's no wonder fans are growing wary of diving into new fantasy series on the platform, especially when closure is so rarely guaranteed. However, while the cycle of cancellation continues, there is hope for fantasy lovers craving something dark, smart, and, most importantly, complete. There's a finished fantasy show out there with all the genre's supernatural grit and boundary-pushing storytelling, and it doesn't leave you hanging. It ran for 4 wild, ambitious seasons and managed to stick the landing with a satisfying and conclusive final episode. Even better, it's already on Netflix and boasts an impressive 87% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. If you're sick of getting burned by premature cancellations, Preacher might be exactly what you've been waiting for. Preacher is a dark and twisted comic book adaptation streaming on Netflix. Preacher blends supernatural fantasy, irreverent humor, and brutal violence into a wild ride that's unlike anything else on Netflix. Preacher is a finished fantasy show that delivers a brutal, bizarre, and often blasphemous take on the genre. Originally airing on AMC from 2016 to 2019, the series is based on the cult comic book by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon, and it wastes no time diving into its twisted mythology. Developed by Sam Catlin, Breaking Bad, Evan Goldberg, and Seth Rogen, Preacher was never meant to be safe, and that's exactly what makes it stand out. This is a world where angels, demons, vampires, and a chain-smoking Irishman can all walk into a bar and probably blow it up before last call. The story of Preacher centers on Jesse Custer, Dominic Cooper, a small-town Texas preacher who suddenly becomes the host of an otherworldly force called Genesis, an entity born from the forbidden union of an angel and a demon. This bizarre gift gives Jesse the literal power of the Word of God, allowing him to command anyone to do whatever he says. Haunted by a violent past and a crisis of faith, Jesse sets out on a cross-country mission to find God, who has gone missing, and hold him accountable. Alongside him are his no-nonsense ex-girlfriend Tulip Aher, Ruth Negga, and hard-drinking vampire sidekick Cassidy, Joseph Gilgun, who bring chaos, charm, and carnage to every episode. What makes Preacher so compelling isn't just its apocalyptic stakes, but its gleeful disregard for boundaries. The show bounces between genres, from road trip comedy to supernatural thriller to religious satire, without ever losing its pulse. Visually inventive and tonally unpredictable, Preacher carves out a space that feels wholly unique in the crowded fantasy TV landscape. There are explosive shootouts, theological debates, twisted humor, and even an entire arc involving Hitler and the Saint of Killers. Yes, really. Critics took notice of its ambition and style. Across its run, Preacher maintained a strong critical reception, ultimately earning an 87% score on Rotten Tomatoes. It might not be as mainstream as Stranger Things or The Witcher, but that's part of its appeal. For fantasy fans looking for something edgier, bloodier, and far more unpredictable, Preacher is a finished fantasy show that's worth the ride. Preacher ran for 4 great seasons, and it had a proper ending. A rare fantasy series that got to finish its story on its own terms. Dominic Cooper as Jesse Custer looks concerned. In a TV era dominated by cliffhanger that never get resolved, Preacher is a breath of fresh air. As a finished fantasy show, it stands out precisely because it wasn't abruptly cancelled, it was allowed to finish its story, from Jesse's first sermon to the final battle between heaven and hell. That alone makes it feel like a rarity among genre TV, especially on Netflix where ambitious fantasy titles often vanish after 1 or 2 seasons. Unlike so many series that go unfinished, Preacher gave fans a proper ending that delivered on the show's chaotic promise. Throughout 4 seasons, Preacher escalated its scope without losing its bite. Season 1 was mostly grounded, slowly pulling viewers into its twisted theology. By Season 4, it was juggling multiple apocalyptic timelines, celestial conspiracies, and philosophical dilemmas about free will and divine justice. Yet even as Preacher got bigger, it never lost sight of its characters. Jess's crisis of faith, Tulip's fierce independence, and Cassidy's struggle with immortality all reached emotionally satisfying conclusions. The Preacher finale, End of the World, doesn't just tie up loose ends, it lands with a finality that's all too rare in the genre. That sense of closure makes Preacher feel like a complete package. It rewards viewers for sticking with it, and it doesn't leave them hanging in the wind. While it may not have had the same cultural footprint as something like Game of Thrones, it sidestepped that show's missteps by staying true to its source material and giving its story the arc it deserved. For fantasy fans who are used to seeing their favorite shows cancelled before they can resolve even a single plot line, Preacher is a surprisingly satisfying exception. The best part is that Preacher is streaming now on Netflix. Whether you're revisiting it or watching for the first time, there's no waiting, no uncertainty, and no cliffhanger to haunt you for years. Just a full story with a beginning, middle, and end, exactly how it should be. In a landscape full of unfinished promises, Preacher is the kind of finished fantasy show that reminds you what great TV can look like when it's actually allowed to end.